Later on? Okay, we'll have an open discussion first. You'll note that the document you've got on your chairs is jointly sponsored by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, so hence the comments that will come later on. But open floor, chance to stand up, agree, disagree, berate, but don't hog forever. Okay. I think a microphone's coming just to capture you. There we go.
Hello, I'm Amy Pollard from CAFOD. This is a question for Andrew, really. As an anthropologist, I was interested by your formulation of more developed countries as having more dense institutions. But I was wondering if there might be a slight problem of of being ethnocentric in what we count as institutions. And what if it's not that they're not there, but just that we don't recognise them as they are existing? And secondly, if you're defining institutions as both organisations and norms, what kind of role do you think it's appropriate for a donor agency such as USAID to play in terms of building norms in developing countries?
Okay, let's not answer that now. Let's take a few. There's a lady at the back.
Hello, Lenny Wild from ODI. Thank you to both our speakers for kind of sharing such open and frank comments about the need to put politics at the heart of development, which is something that here at ODI we're kind of keen to work further on and to develop as well. I wanted to ask you both your thoughts on kind of what can be done differently in light of the comments that you've made. I mean, thinking about the challenges around how bureaucracies are working, the incentives within aid agencies and the organisational frameworks and challenges that you've highlighted, how do you make the monkeys learn, I guess? How would you like to see things done differently?
Okay, there's a gentleman right here. Who's our third?
Richard Horsey, I'm a World Bank consultant. I wanted to raise the issue of that subset of failed states which have failed not because of weak institutions but because of subverted institutions. That is the authoritarian states. And we can think of North Korea, Zimbabwe, Myanmar and so on. In those situations, it seems that, and this is relevant, I think, to both of the presentations, the idea that we do service delivery rather than institution building is in some ways more appealing. And yet I would argue it's still, for the reasons that you've put forward, completely the wrong approach. But that leaves us with a challenge, right? How do we do institution building when the institution is already subverted to the wrong ends, and therefore we are building the capacity to oppress rather than necessarily the capacity to deliver? How would you think about those?
Okay, one more. There's a gentleman over there. Purple shirt.
Thank you. Andy Rutherford from One World Action. 20 years of interesting experience in Angola, and therefore all the comments I felt was exceedingly pertinent. If I could just briefly marry the two, and if we are looking for more institutions, but fundamentally accountable institutions, and therefore active citizens engaging with those institutions, 100% agreement. So, in the context of Andrew's challenge and a log frame obsessed distribution of taxpayers' money, how do you deal with that? How do you square the two off?
Okay. Start off.
Well,
just take it as you'd like.
Sure. Well, I'm writing the conclusion to this paper on the way back on the plane. And it's the hardest part to write because the original conclusion didn't fix anything. I mean, it relisted all the problems, and it doesn't restructure the incentive system within Washington that's created aid as an institution as it functions now. And so I'm struggling with that myself. But the first thing to say is there's a study that was done of failed states by Ted Gurr, Jack Goldstone, and a third political scientist. It was done for the CIA, but it was made public. And they're well-known scholars in the United States in this area. And they looked at failed states, and they looked at highly functional states. And it's very interesting. They said all the highly functional states were the same in all the major areas, and each one of the failed states failed individually for unique reasons. Okay, so the worst thing to do in an aid agency is to have a highly centralized system for developing programs, for spending money. We had in AID the most decentralized of all the aid. We actually did a study of the 9 steps in the program development process, and 7 of the 9 steps were decentralized to the mission director and the staff in the field for most of the Cold War. This was from the 50s until the mid-90s when the model changed. And now all of those 7 steps are being centralized in Washington increasingly. All of the authority for aid officers to, for example, spend money have been rescinded. And all of that now has been centralized in the State Department. So no aid officer may spend any money, even in Washington, without specific approval for an individual line item. So we are doing the exact opposite. Many institutions, like the World Bank and DFID, are now trying to decentralize to the field. So if I had to look at the structure of aid, I'd put all the field staff in the countries. And there should be almost no one left at the headquarters. That's the first thing I would do. 2, I decentralize substantially all of those steps to the field. 3rd, I would make the terms that foreign service officers and aid serve, it's exactly the opposite of what we do now. What we do now is we have them serve for 1 year in dysfunctional states, because it's hard, you can't bring your family and your spouse and all that. For personnel reasons, our people are functioning in Sudan, southern Sudan, for 1 year, then they go to another assignment. The normal time is 4 years. What Douglas North says is that in fragile or failed states, everything's about personal relationships. Well, you can't develop personal relationships in 1 year. So we should be having shorter terms for foreign service officers in countries that are highly functional. Ghana, for example, not highly functional. If they're highly functional, there's no point in having an aid program. And in countries that are failed states, we should be having 6, 7, 8-year terms. So people get to know people. They know what the political power structure is. Since there are no institutions, they know how to understand how power is used and how it functions. So 3rd, I would make AID, I would make any aid agency entirely independent of their defense and their diplomatic service. Why is that? Because these issues need to get to senior policy levels in Washington. Now, there are no AID officers at any National Security Council meetings. We used to have a seat, we lost the seat, okay? Supposedly, state is representing us at these meetings. I'm not making fun of State Department. State Department is a great, in my view, one of the best diplomatic institutions bilaterally in the world. I think it's a wonderful institution. It is, however, focused on diplomacy. The debate we have here today is not a debate you have in the State Department. You have an entirely different set of debates appropriate to a diplomatic institution. So I think you need independence for an aid agency. You need a different personnel system, in my view. The 3rd thing we need is we need to reform the oversight and compliance rules that are sending the wrong messages. The notion that we should be judging aid officers by how fast they disperse money is madness. The European Union does that. All the aid agencies do that. If you don't spend the money, you lose the money. Well, that means you're not spending the time in the field to interact with the people whose country it is. If you do that, it slows everything down, particularly in institutionally weak states. Second issue brought up here was, so I've dealt, that's the question of aid reform. What do you do? When I mentioned the importance of institutions, I was describing Douglas North's theory, okay? Are there, the reason you want to live in the country for 7, 8 years is to understand that all institutions are not formal. Some of them are informal, but they are there one way or the other. And some of them, if they're informal, can also be easily destroyed. The more formal an institution, the harder it is to damage it. The clearer the rules of the game when they're formal, okay? So people in the development community sort of are in love with the informal institutions, not realizing there are serious weaknesses to it. Douglas North does something in his book which is very interesting. He actually quantifies the number of institutions, legal institutions in the United States. There are 18 million legal businesses in the United States. There are 1 million nonprofit, domestic, I don't mean NGO, international NGOs, I mean domestic nonprofit institutions. There are 56,000 government, independent units of government in the United States. And when they found out, very interesting, there's a big difference between the US and Europe on this. Europe is more centralized. The US is much more decentralized. We have huge density of institutions at the state and local level, not at the federal level, okay? What they found in the study is where the number of institutions at the government level are not relevant. What's relevant is that they exist somewhere, okay? You can't have an informal government institution that actually provides services. There has to be some system that legitimizes it in terms of the delivery of services, the making of laws, because the rule of law is about writing things down in some form or other. Okay, I recognize that in poor countries there are informal rules. The reality is, if you read Douglas North, and I agree with him, the society can function with those rules. They will not become a developed country unless they formalize them. And that's the point of the book. You can, in fact, exist and function under these rules. If your goal is to develop to a highly open access order, which is what he calls our societies are an aberration in human history. They've only existed the last 150 years. They never existed before that. The reason we're so rich and so powerful, we have so much stability in our societies relative to the rest of the last 10,000 years, is because of the formality of the institutions and their strength.
Okay. Dan, want to pick up some points, particularly what would you do differently?
I think that I start from what point that Andrew was making, which I very much agreed with about the time spent in countries. I think one of the things to understand is that the kind of work which is required from international agencies, whether they're intergovernmental, governmental, whether it's the bank, NGOs, it's labor intensive and knowledge intensive. So along the way, one needs to knock to one side some of the obsession with transaction costs and the low headcount and moving large amounts of money with very few people in control of that. Not because it gives you too little oversight or monitoring, but because it gives you too little effectiveness. It gives you too little capacity to design and guide actually the kind of interventions which you're wanting to make. So that, to me, means that there needs to be a big emphasis on analytical capacities. There needs to be a big emphasis on familiarity, this sort of exchange which is going on about the institutions, about understanding the realities. I mean, one of the things in the North book about institutions and about developed societies is the importance that people believe in the system. Right? So the way in which the formal institutions function also includes its own kind of informality in there. So even where you have formal institutions, you need to understand the sort of the fine-grained reality of what is going on. And you don't pick that up in 2-3 years. You need considerable period of time. So you need a kind of professional formation of people which takes them in that direction, and you need the training and the capacity to be developing that. And you need institutions which are doing this, which are themselves flexible and learning institutions, because you're consistently coming across things which you couldn't predict. A log frame is a very useful planning tool, but you cannot put the whole of the DRC into even the best log frame in the world. And you cannot, however good your conflict analytical framework is, you still got to use your bonds at some point. So knowledge and understanding and the capacity of individuals is enormously important, and the ability of institutions to embrace and encourage and support that, I think, is extremely important. The question about how do you do institution building where the institutions are being subverted, I think probably my stab at an answer based on our experience, which doesn't, by the way, include the cases which you mentioned, such as Zimbabwe. But our starting point would be, well, you don't actually begin with the institutions in the sense that they're not there, they're not really functioning, they're shells. You actually begin with people. You begin perhaps with people, they might be leaders of communities, they might be business entrepreneurs, they could well be people organized in community groups. Local NGOs are very useful starting points. It's fine-grained and it's slow work, but you sort of, you push something along and you get something going. And doing a lot of small-scale things is, in my view, a better way to be engaging in DRC as we are at the moment in a variety of different contexts in eastern part of the country. It's better to be doing a large number of small things than a few very large things. And I will leave that there for the moment.
Okay, we do have the remaining small point about active citizens. Do you want to make just a quick comment?
Yeah, I think in fact it's a segue from the answer that I was just giving, because I think that what we have found, I mean, I suppose you could say the worst places that International Alert has worked over the last 15 to 20 years would include Burundi, when several thousand people each year were dying in the conflicts there, Liberia during the Charles Taylor period, Eastern DRC just any time, and one or two other places like that, Sri Lanka also in its own way. And what we've always found is that there are always people with whom to work. You need to approach them with a certain amount of sort of humility and openness. You need to find people with whom you develop. Very often it's finding individuals with whom you develop relationships. And where we have constructed or helped construct institutions there in the NGO sense, it's come out of those personal encounters. It's been workshopping in Burundi in 1997, I think it was, where at the end of it, somebody said at the closing dinner in a sort of informal way, you know, this was terribly interesting. Do you think we could have a Burundian organization which could do this kind of thing? Do you think International Alert could help us somehow? I mean, with training the trainers and maybe funding it and so on. And that we did. And there's now an organization called Dushara Hamwe, which means let's get together, which is a nationwide umbrella organization for women's peace activity that has trained about 14,500 mediators and facilitators in conflict resolution skills. And that's a contribution which is being made at village level. And it started through a personal conversation. And then, of course, you have to stick in at it for a decade and a half.
Okay, next round. Simon Maxwell.
Yeah, hi, Simon Maxwell from ODI. I have the advantage of having read Andrew's review of the Claire Lockhart and Ashraf Ghani book, which is a fascinating and very entertaining read. So I'm going to ask you, among other things, just to remind us where we can find it. But I can always email it to anybody who needs it, because you have very different understandings of the problem and of the solutions, and it would be worth talking a bit more in detail about Afghanistan. I think if Ashraf were here, or Claire, there are two or three things they would want to say to you. The first thing they would say is that when you see rich countries with lots of institutions and poor countries without, so to speak, you have to be very clear what the causality is, and it might be that the richness comes first and the institutions afterwards, and I'm sure Douglas North has thought of that, but it's worth perhaps thinking about here. Secondly, they would say that sometimes the interventions that they talk a lot about around delivering health and education and so on are actually the route to the creation of institutions. And so, you know, there's a process going on in which your best entry point may be health and education. I think Ashraf would say that people have essentially rights that have to be recognised, either through humanitarian relief or through the provision of the services that we're talking about. And thanks so much. We're not going to wait for 15 years while the monkeys learn the tricks or the institutions develop. Actually, people need health and education and security and justice, like now this minute. And then fourthly, I think Ashraf would say that actually one of the main blockages in Afghanistan to moving along this route was USAID. And that's why your exchange with him is so entertaining. Because Ashraf says, look, we had the core institutions in place, we had the government, and he describes graphically the district capital where the government district commissioner was sitting on the floor in a disused Save the Children Fund tent because there was no money for a building or furniture, and all around the USAID NGOs were building 5-story headquarter buildings for their work in the area. So I think you owe us, and you owe him, a slightly more nuanced discussion of the key points that he's making in the book, and I'd love to hear you summarise the points that were in your review.
Okay, hold the peace.
We can't have too many questions because then we can't answer them.
No.
I mean, really, because I'm forgetting literally what the questions are.
Okay, we'll just hold that one. There's a lady there. Back.
Thanks. Kirsty Hughes from Oxfam. 2 points. One to support what you said in a sense. Earlier this afternoon, I was with some other agencies giving a Mother's Day card to David Cameron about maternal mortality. And as he accepted that, he said, the thing is we've got to show really concrete examples. How are we going to get the public to support us ring-fencing aid at a time of recession if we can't show malaria nets, if we can't show precise outcomes? So that's political, but it's also about public opinion and it's about the funding of aid. In a sense, my second point and question to you is about that as well, and perhaps it's to follow on from the previous previous comment in defence of monkeys, perhaps. I mean, yes, we do service delivery, but I can also stand here and trade with you, of course. Lots of examples on the ground of where we're doing capacity building for accountability, working with local civil society to build institutions. We even operate in one or two places where we literally only have advocacy and campaigns office. But my question to you and also to my own organisation is, how far can we take that? Dan Smith said this is political. Yes, this is extremely political. What is this going to do to our neutrality, to the way we deliver aid, and also to that critical question of access, of our ability to be there? Because these are all real live questions that we're facing now, some of which it wouldn't even be possible to go into detail on the record at the moment.
Okay, let's respond, because I know you want to...
Yeah. Well, if Ashraf were here, I would say all of the things he said were such a great success within the Afghan government were done with aid contractors or different contractors. The three great examples he gives were all done with heavy technical support from external sources. And the notion that they did this on their own is utter nonsense. I mean, that book is almost fiction, frankly, in terms of what actually happened. Are there, I mean, it is. I mean, people will sit here, aid offices, and say, "What?" I mean, Ashraf doesn't even have the statistics right. He does a lot of stuff from memory, and the memory's simply wrong factually. I mean, you can go back to find out what actually happened. The health program was probably the most successful thing we did. What's your big journal? Lancet? Lancet said in their, and they're one of the leading public health journals in the West. They said the model for how to do public health in the aftermath of a conflict is what we did. And when I say we, it didn't mention AID in it, but it was the AID, we designed it, okay? And it was an aid contractor that put it in place. It happened to be there was a woman general who was the Minister of Health who was excellent. She's a tough lady. She's the only one held over from Taliban. And she had 4 or 5 very senior people who were superb. A whole system was designed around them, frankly. It worked very well, but it wouldn't have happened. It's not just a matter of putting money in her ministry. It was a function of getting a plan in place that combined what she was doing with what was being done through aid agencies from people from the outside who had done this before. So am I suggesting we shouldn't do service? Well, absolutely not, Simon. If I gave that, I actually only, what I gave was the introduction to the lecture. The rest of it I never got to because I talk too much sometimes. What you have to do in service delivery is to do the institution building as part of the service delivery, which is what we did with the Ministry of Health. We could show after 7 years the child mortality rates declined by 24% and the maternal mortality rates by 25%, or vice versa. I can't remember which percentage. So we can show actual concrete results for the people back home who want to know, what, and we built a system, and we, by the way, put $130 million in AID in a budget support account just for the Ministry of Health, protected, okay? The notion that Ashraf suggests that you can make all these decisions non-politically and some with a national development plan, rubbish. They were threatening to kill him, for heaven's sake, at cabinet meetings. You can read my article. It was in the American Interest. It was last year. It was published. It was either last year or the year before. I think it was 2008 I published it. But if you go to andrewnatsios.com, no space, one word, that's my sort of website. I put all my articles on it so that it's easier to get to. And it's called Arrested Development. No, that's a different book. Anyway, whatever it is. But to go back to Ashraf, I'm not saying we shouldn't deliver services. I'm saying that has to be done in terms of institution building. And Ashraf himself told me that Rabbani put 100,000 of his soldiers on the state payroll, and they remain on the payroll. Many of them were completely illiterate. They had no skills whatsoever. The notion we're going to put money into the system that pays salaries of someone a warlord who was in the government in January of 2002, he told me they had to put a freeze on hiring because the warlords were dumping people in the payroll. I mean, this is a fantasy, an account of what really happened. Are there things that succeeded? Yes, there are. The development of local media was a big success. What we do too much is we associate large amounts of money with success. That was a $15 million program. It's been one of our biggest successes in Afghanistan. These are independent radio, television stations They have nothing, no relationship to AID anymore. There's no money through the NGO that helped create them. They, we're careful in designing them that they didn't fall into the hands of a warlord or used for other purposes. And there's a study that was done at the Harvard Business School of this, comparing this to the $200 million spent in Iraq on this by the Defense Department to supposedly create a media there, which was a disaster. Some things work, and I would argue smaller money is better, because it means the aid offices can spend more money and more time on the details of how, because it's all about implementation. It's all about the details of how this is done. I think scaling up in Afghanistan is a very bad idea. If you pump more money into non-existent institutions, whether they're aid institutions or domestic, you're going to have a huge amount of waste of money, and you have huge amounts of dysfunction. I think it's the notion, this scaling up thing, this giant snowball coming down a hill, is a terrible idea.
Okay. September, October 2008, the American interest, and Ashraf is the keynote speaker at the DFID conference tomorrow.
Okay. There we go. The issue around can politics be neutral?
I think there are two distinct strands on this. Perhaps because we are a small NGO which never has offices of more than sort of 5 or 10 people, we would not want to engage in politics in a way which was supporting one side or another. I think that there are plenty of people within the ODA architecture internationally who are interpreting engaging with politics as at least potentially meaning, well, then you support the sort of the progressive political forces, or however you describe them, against those which are more corrupt or more oppressive or less modernizing or whatever. And I think that that debate is completely an unanswered one, an unconcluded one as yet. And different organizations have got different interests which partly explain why they are why they take the position that they do. I mean, when we were in Colombo, it's not continuing now, but there was a period when we were getting regular visits from the police, from the NGO officer of the local CID, the detective force. And he wanted to be interviewing our staff. He didn't want to be interviewing our country director or our accountant. He wanted to interview the younger staff and ask them, as a friend, does your family know about this? You're a nice young woman. Do you think this will affect your marriage prospects at all, that you're working for this international NGO? I just say this as a friend. I mean, this kind of pressure steadily coming on in that kind of context. Obviously, our interest in the work which we're doing means that while we're trying to analyze politically, discuss policy issues, the political issues, we're not wanting to take sides, right? And that's, I think, the same kind of thing that you were talking about, Kirsty, that Oxfam will be in places where it wants not to be in that kind of partisan position. But of course, we know that almost whatever you do, there's going to be pressure. I mean, sometimes not taking sides will be seen as by one side as being, well, that's not good enough. If you're not with us, you're against us. I forget who it is who said that, actually. But that kind of dilemma is arising a lot, and I just think it's an unresolved and extremely important discussion at the moment.
Okay, now we're tight on time, but I'm conscious lots of people want to say things, so let's have some quick interventions, which don't have to be questions. There we go.
Okay, well, Bill Bird from the World Bank. The temptation is to get involved in that earlier debate, but in line with your suggestion, Chair, I won't do that, except to say that the World Bank has provided $275 million of budget support for the Afghan government, so I think it's also important to be proactive and take risks in supporting the government. My question really, and I guess it's to both of the speakers, is about the political analysis, who does it and for what? Because I think there's a lot of good discussion about the need to put this into, for this to influence and the context to affect development programs. But who does it? I mean, it seems to me that diplomats are almost inevitably compromised because they have to represent the political interests of their home countries. So they can't really put themselves completely in the shoes of the country itself, of the host country itself. You talk to the UNDPA, they may do some interesting political analysis. They don't want to share it typically, especially anything of a major and sensitive issue. So really the question, do the aid agencies have to develop a bit of capacity and bring in academics and so on to do political analysis? Or who should be doing this sort of more for the international community?
Thank you. Next comment. Anybody want to make next? Over here's a man over here. Have his hand up. There we go.
Thanks. Nick Leffler from Dan Smith International. You mentioned the need to increase terms for foreign service officers in fragile states because of the importance of relationship building. What happens when cabinet reshuffles occur, which are frequent in fragile states, and you lose that relationship? How do you achieve effectiveness?
Okay, and there's a lady here.
Very quickly, I have a slight worry, and this builds from the whole meeting series that we had on these issues in the last few months. I've been involved in it from the beginning. I think that as a community of policy researchers and analysts, we've become very effective at the argument about the centrality of politics and how much new approaches are needed. Political analysis is so central. Organizations like DFID are taking this on and becoming much more alert and astute about those issues. Meanwhile, in parallel, the debate about how organizations should work and how aid should be organized is all about value for money, is all about showing it impact at all costs, is all about doing more with less, is all about scaling up aid. And I've got the feeling that we are a bit missing the boat on that one, because if what we need is what you described, more time in the field, being the learning organization, doing things radically different from what we're doing it now, well, we are not talking so much about it. As we're not putting enough effort in engaging on those debates, which are not necessarily about policy, but are about the bureaucracy, incentives, and how organizations should work. And if we want to be successful with this message, we need to start to move towards that ground to make things change.
Okay, anyone else would like to add in? The gentleman at the back over there. There's one more. There's a lady at the back. Okay.
Question for both speakers. Liam Swiss, University of Ottawa. I was wondering if you could comment on the implications for the closer relationship between aid and military engagement, and on how aid's perceived in the field, and whether this is putting aid workers or aid agencies at greater risk in terms of their overall engagement in fragile states.
All right, and the last comment. The lady back there.
I'm sorry I'm late. I don't know what was discussed here, but this very important thing, as I come from Sri Lanka, which has been receiving aid for decades, which has been exacerbating the conflict. It has, the wall of sovereignty or the shield of sovereignty has been shielding the oppressed ethnic minorities from the rest of the world. Is there any research that has ventured out to determine how much was achieved in any of the recipient countries, as opposed to the enrichment of some elites in those developing countries? Have they looked at the bank accounts of those people and the very poor people who don't receive anything?
Okay, thank you. Dan, do you want to just wrap up your responses?
Sure, if I possibly can. I mean, the question of political analysis, who does it and for what? I mean, the trite, but I think I would stand by answer is everybody, and so that you can work. And I think that to see the political analysis in terms of, well, we'll get someone to write a report, and that report will be delivered, and then it'll be read. Political analysis should actually be living and breathing, which means that you're talking about it all the time, and you're discussing the political issues in the country where you're working, and the institution makes it possible for you to have those meetings. They may be brown bag seminars, they may be all staff meetings, they may be gatherings like this, they may be just providing social space where you can have lunch. There can be all sorts of things which are done, but that discussion needs to keep on going forward. And if you have, I think, a group of reasonably well motivated people who stay in place for a period of time and develop the right kind of knowledge and want to exchange and share it, then the work of all of them will benefit. And I think that when those relationships get interrupted by changes in the political landscape, then there's a continuity of those relationships, which is quite important. So you don't give up talking to somebody because this week he's not the Minister of Transport anymore, because the year after next he's going to be back as the Minister of Education or something, or his cousin is, or whatever, because that is the way that the power system works in those countries. I want to pick up the point that was made at the front very quickly about this kind of bifurcation of the ODA debate. I think what's happening is that people are seeing the same, broadly speaking, the same set of issues that give rise to concern. Are the MDGs going to be fulfilled? If the MDGs are fulfilled, will that actually add up to development? Has all of this increase in investment, how effective and productive is it really being? There are some good answers to be found in parts of interrogating that, but there are also some difficult and worrying answers. And faced with some of the more worrisome answers, I think there's one trend in the direction of put politics at the heart of development, because it's fundamentally a political question. And there's others who say, well, if we just focused more on impact. Right? So it's the same set of issues which are there, but at the moment, some of the answers are bifurcating in that way, under various different influences. And I suppose that from my side, as a CEO of a small NGO, I would say, well, we who want to put politics in the forefront have got to learn how to narrate the impact of that. We've got to quantify what is quantifiable, we've got to narrate what is narratable, and we've got to analyse the rest for the impact. 2 seconds. 2 seconds, good. The implications of a closer relationship between aid and military engagement, or more broadly, between aid and development issues and what are normally seen as security issues. There are some troubling implications here, but the one thing which I would say, because of the 2-second promise, right, is that to see the security issue or the relationship between security and development, peace and development, as necessitating a shift to using military instruments is, in my view, a childishly simple-minded attitude towards the question of security, of what security comes from, of what builds it. Yes, the military and indeed law and order has a function there, but so also does the social contract, so does the nature of the institutions, so does the broader development agenda that we've been talking about. So personally, I'm not afraid of the security linkage, but I want to insist that security and military engagement are not synonymous terms.
Okay, last couple of minutes.
Several things. In terms of the political analysis, we used to have, during the Cold War up until the mid-90s, a requirement that you couldn't do a project or a program, sector-based, whatever it is, unless you did a political economic analysis. And there was a checklist you had to do. And at least the checklist was not a compliance thing, that was the audit right and all this. This was, you had to do an economic analysis, but it was on the checklist. The problem with checklists is you produce the documents in there. If it's audited, you know you did the thing, so you don't get gigged on the audit. That's not the idea here. The idea is for the officers who design the programs and implement the programs, they have to understand this themselves. And there are 2 ways to do that. One is to make sure you have enough officers in the field so that they're not just contract managers. They're actually out in the field, in the villages, talking to people, talking to power brokers to understand what's really going on. I mean, Fred Cuny was a master at this, and he taught me how to do this 20 years ago when I sent him into Somalia and a whole bunch of other places. And I just watched him, and he would stand in a market for a week in the middle of a famine or a war, and I said, what are you doing? He said, I'll tell you what's happening in this society in a week. And he would have a translator. He'd find an intellectual from the community or was an educated person. He would just watch. And when he finished, he would know what's going on. Bob Grissoni can do that. I mean, there are a few people with those kind of skills. We should be training all our officers to do this, not as independent consultants brought in to do a paper that's stuck in a report, but the people who actually manage everything has to have this in their brain. Because you wouldn't manage something if you knew intrinsically that everything you were doing was counterproductive. You wouldn't do that. And so that's why it's essential that people be there a long time and that they interact with a society, which is how the old system used to work before the 1990s. Now I think we've distorted the system very seriously. I have to say, I think the reason I said at the beginning, there's this growing gap between aid practice and aid theory. And I don't mean aid theory, really the ethereal debate. I mean all the evaluations we're doing, all the thinking we're doing about this. The reason there's a gap, a growing gap, is because the capitals and the international system are debating the wrong issues, in my view. I used to go to these meetings, and I would go into fury when I would get home and say, what are these people, what are we doing in these meetings? Why did we negotiate that? And I sent you out to negotiate this. You said, Andrew, we can't get beaten up again at meetings because you have problems with the international system again. So we would cope by going in. We agreed to the I told President Bush, endorse the MDGs. We're doing a huge amount in these areas. We're doing service delivery. Endorse them all. I mean, I think the MDGs were a terrible idea. We're focusing our attention on service delivery once again. Not on whether the country can do the work themselves with their own institutions, but whether or not we're delivering all these services. And we're focused again on results, measurable results. The most transformational thing, this is the last thing I'll say, the most transformational things in these societies are the least measurable. And the most measurable, the easiest to measure, are the least transformational. I used to repeat that in aid all the time. People get sick of hearing it. They said, Andrew, that's not where the system is pushing us.
Well, with that very powerful thought, let's thank Andrew and Dan for their insights. For all the things they or I have not responded to, apologies. But then we're going to have a moment where Alison and also we're going to have a comment from Bastian. So let's just thank our two speakers, and particularly